Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into something pretty wild. It's a fascinating biological journey that literally starts with the everyday food sitting right there on your dinner plate, zooms all the way down into your microscopic cellular machinery, and finally decodes the unique, hidden instructions inside your DNA. We're talking about unlocking the biological secrets of vitamin K. But as you're going to see in just a minute, what we always thought was just a simple, basic nutrient is actually this incredibly complex family of molecules, and it's intimately tied to one of the most widely prescribed and, honestly, one of the most unpredictable medications in the whole world.
So, here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We're going to start with the two faces of K, then move beyond the blood clot, dive deep into the vitamin K cycle, explore the warfarin disruption, and finally, wrap things up with the genetics of dosing. Let's get right into it.
All right, part one, the two faces of K.
So for decades, we've kind of just thought of vitamin K as this single entity, right? The coagulation vitamin. But actually, it's a family of compounds, and there is a massive difference between its two main faces. On one hand, we've got vitamin K1, also known as phyloquinone. This comes from plants, and when you eat it, your liver sweeps it up super fast to drive blood clotting. On the other hand, we have vitamin K2, the menaquinones. Now, these come from bacterial fermentation, and because your liver clears K2 much more slowly, it can actually travel through your bloodstream to reach totally different tissues, like your bones and your heart. Basically, their distinct structures dictate completely different destinations inside your body.
Let's break down where we actually get these vitamins from our food. Take natto, for example. It's a Japanese fermented soybean dish, and just 3 ounces of it packs a whopping 850 micrograms of vitamin K2. That is over 700% of your daily value. Compare that to things like collard greens and spinach. Those are fantastic sources of vitamin K1 for sure, but they have basically zero K2. And even animal products like chicken liver contain only a tiny fraction of K2 compared to fermented foods.
And this brings us to a really massive aha moment in nutritional science. It's called the triage theory. Picture a hospital emergency room. Doctors naturally treat the most immediate, life-threatening injuries first, right? Well, your body literally does the exact same thing with nutrients. If you aren't getting enough total vitamin K, your body just uses whatever it has to make sure your blood clots. Because without that, you wouldn't survive a paper cut. But the trade-off? It abandons the long-term maintenance of your bones and your arteries, which leads to accelerated aging. So you won't bleed out, but you are quietly accumulating chronic damage over time.
Which leads us to part two, beyond the blood clot.
Okay, so what actually happens when we bypass this biological triage and consume enough vitamin K2 to reach our deeper tissues? Well, it acts like a masterful biological traffic cop, specifically for calcium. First off, it activates a protein called MGP. And MGP's whole job is to bind to calcium and stop it from turning your flexible arteries into rigid, calcified pipes. Second, K2 activates osteocalcin, which grabs that calcium and glues it directly into your bones, right where it belongs. And it doesn't stop at calcium. K2 even supports sphingolipid synthesis in the brain, helping maintain the actual structural integrity of your brain cells. How cool is that? And the clinical results of this internal traffic control are absolutely staggering. Look at the famous Rotterdam study. They followed thousands of adults for years, and they found that the individuals with the highest dietary intake of vitamin K2 saw a 57% reduction in coronary heart disease mortality compared to the folks with the lowest intake. 57%. They also saw a massive reduction in severe aortic calcification.
But here's the kicker, and this is absolutely crucial. In that exact same study, dietary intake of vitamin K1 showed literally zero protective association against cardiovascular mortality. None. Because K1 is swept up so fast by the liver for blood clotting, it just never reaches the arteries to activate those protective proteins. This proves why understanding the difference between K1 and K2 isn't just fun biology trivia, it is literally life-saving information.
Moving on to part 3, the vitamin K cycle. To really grasp how all this works, and to understand the medical interventions we're going to talk about next, we need to go a bit further down the rabbit hole, into your microscopic cellular machinery. Welcome to the vitamin K cycle. It's basically a continuous recycling loop designed so you don't run out of this vital nutrient. It starts with active vitamin K, which drives the activation of those bone and artery proteins we just talked about. Now, in that process, the vitamin gets oxidized. Essentially, it gets used up. So, to be useful again, it has to be recycled. Steps 3 and 4 are the critical recycling phases here, and they rely entirely on a very specific, very important enzyme called VKORC1.
I cannot overstate how high the stakes are for this cycle. Without that VKORC1 recycling enzyme working perfectly, your body would burn through its active vitamin K almost instantly. Blood clotting would just halt, tissue protection would completely stop. It is the absolute bottleneck of the entire system. Now, keep this enzyme in the back of your mind, because it's about to come under attack.
That brings us to part 4, the warfarin disruption.
Enter the villain of our biochemical story. Though, to be fair, it's also a medical marvel. I'm talking about warfarin. It's a highly disruptive blood thinner taken by tens of millions of people worldwide to prevent life-threatening blood clots. But how does it actually work? Well, it deliberately crashes the vitamin K cycle we just looked at. Warfarin is a competitive inhibitor of that specific VKORC1 enzyme. By blocking the enzyme, warfarin halts the regeneration of active vitamin K. And without active vitamin K, the liver just cannot activate the key clotting factors. It essentially forces a controlled, functional vitamin K deficiency in the patient. As you can imagine, it is an incredibly high-stakes balancing act between preventing a fatal clot and causing a fatal bleed.
Now, researchers at the Cleveland Clinic discovered something fascinating. Warfarin doesn't just cleanly turn the enzyme off, it uncouples it. They brilliantly describe this warfarin-inhibited system as a one-armed juggler. It weakly blocks the first recycling step, but severely compromises the final step. So the juggler is impaired, but amazingly, still manages to keep a few balls in the air.
But here is the major plot twist. Because that one-armed juggler is still tossing a few of those intermediate molecules up into the air, a mysterious secondary enzyme, one that is completely resistant to warfarin, can step in. It grabs those molecules, combines them with fresh vitamin K from your diet, and bypasses the bottleneck entirely. This is exactly why patients on warfarin have to keep their dietary intake of vitamin K strictly consistent. A sudden spike in dietary vitamin K fuels this secondary enzyme, and that can completely reverse the drug's blood-thinning effect literally overnight.
Finally, let's look at part 5, the genetics of dosing. So, we've got a drug with a super narrow safety window, battling against your daily diet and these complex enzyme cycles. But it gets even crazier when we look at why warfarin is so unpredictable and uniquely dependent on your individual DNA. Welcome to the world of pharmacogenetics. It turns out, tiny spelling changes in your DNA, known as polymorphisms, drastically alter how sensitive you are to warfarin. For example, there's a common variant in the gene for that VKORC1 enzyme that means some people naturally just produce less of it. With less enzyme to begin with, you need a significantly lower dose of warfarin to block it. On top of that, an entirely different enzyme, called CYP2C9, is responsible for clearing warfarin out of your body. If you have a genetic variant that slows down CYP2C9, the drug builds up in your system, which massively increases the risk of a fatal bleed. Take a look at how these genetic variants are distributed globally. Your ancestry plays a really massive role in your dosing requirements. The sensitive VKORC1 variant is present in about 90% of Asian populations, 40% of European populations, but only 14% of African American populations. This perfectly explains why, clinically speaking, patients of Asian descent generally require much lower starting doses of this drug.
And the genetic complexity goes even deeper with that CYP2C9 clearance enzyme we mentioned. Variants known as STAR2 and STAR3 are common in European and Asian ancestries. But historically, global dosing algorithms actually failed African American patients because they totally ignored genetic variants specific to African ancestry. Variants like STAR5, STAR6, STAR8, and STAR11, along with the really specific cluster variant called RS12777823, are prevalent in African populations and are absolutely crucial for doctors to calculate a safe, lower dose for those patients.
And just to keep doctors on their toes, right, there is another genetic factor that does the exact opposite. The CYP4F2 enzyme's whole job is to remove excess vitamin K from the liver. If a patient has the STAR3 genetic variant, this enzyme doesn't work as well, meaning vitamin K naturally accumulates in their liver. Because they have more vitamin K just hanging around, these specific patients actually require a slightly higher dose of warfarin to overcome it.
So how in the world do we solve this? Well, we combine genetics with medicine. Pharmacogenetic algorithms take a patient's DNA profile, looking at all these specific variants we just talked about, and mathematically calculate the safest possible starting dose. And guess what? This outperforms standard clinical guessing every single time.
Genotype-guided dosing significantly reduces the time it takes to stabilize a patient's blood, preventing those incredibly dangerous extremes of internal bleeding or fatal blood clots. It simply removes the deadly guesswork from prescribing narrow-index drugs.
Man, we've covered a lot of ground today. From the triage of everyday nutrition to the advanced genetic algorithms of life-saving drugs. But let's bring it all back to you for a second. We've seen that standard dietary recommendations are mostly based on vitamin K1, basically just enough to keep your blood clotting. But knowing what you know now about the amazing protective power of vitamin K2 for your bones and your heart, are you getting enough K2 to prevent the quiet drivers of age-related disease? Definitely something to think about next time you look at your plate. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I'll catch you next time.